Yo, here's everything you need to know about colonial America in 30 minutes or less. All right. Now, obviously, we're not gonna cover every minor detail, but we will address topics such as the Declaration, the Enlightenment, and the Intolerable Acts. If that sounds good to you, let's get into episode 4 of Civics IQ, Colonial America. Okay, so let's talk about the colonial governments and the colonies on a general level. So what is a colony? A colony is an area of a settlement in one place that is controlled by another country. So in this scenario, we're talking about the English colonies that are on the eastern coast of what will become the United States of America. So early colonists, people don't really remember this, but it's definitely an important fact to remember. Early colonists were loyal to Britain, right? They saw themselves as British. They had a British identity. So it wasn't like these people came over to the New World, into the new colonies, and automatically disassociated from the British crown. It's actually quite the opposite. They were loyal to Britain. So traditions, beliefs, other things that kind of made them carry that British identity were still very, very present within the early colonies. So in Virginia, the first actual colonial settlement is known as Jamestown. And this settlement was set by the Virginia Company, and this was a company owned by a bunch of British businessmen and merchants. Just like any colony throughout history, okay, the purpose of a colony is to make money for the mother country. All right, so the Virginia Company set up that first colony in Jamestown, hoping that that colony would produce goods that they could sell throughout the world and obviously make a profit on. So at first, Jamestown was actually ruled by a governor and a council who were appointed by the Virginia Company. But as time went on, the company actually kind of gave some of that power away and allowed those people, residents of Jamestown, to elect their own officials to govern them. And this was in an attempt to attract more colonists to that area. Those colonists elected people to represent them, and we called them burgesses, and this eventually led to the House of Burgesses. So the House of Burgesses was actually the first elected assembly in the colonies, and this was the first example of a representative democracy in the colonies at this time. So like many people at this time, a group of colonists set sail for Virginia seeking religious freedom. Although they were on their way to Virginia, a storm actually blew them off course and they wound up in the colony of Massachusetts. In order to kind of preserve their way of life and survive, these would-be colonists knew that they needed to form some sort of government. So out of this, we have the Mayflower Compact. So the Mayflower Compact, basically all of these would-be settlers who were on their way to Virginia but wound up in Massachusetts, got together in a direct fashion and drew out a contract for government that each of them would follow. Because they sat together and directly talked about this, they didn't represent anybody or elect anybody to represent them. They did it on their own. This would be an example of a direct democracy. So because the population of Plymouth was so small, members of the Plymouth area could come and kind of air their grievances and discuss governmental business one-on-one without having to elect somebody to represent them. But only some members could vote on issues. When we're talking about settling the colonies, most of the colonists came from areas like England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Germany. So a lot of European settlers. Like we talked about in our previous video, enslaved Africans were brought from Africa to the colonies in order to work. Although the majority of the colonies were founded by England, some weren't. An example is New York, that was founded by the Dutch. Delaware and New Jersey were founded by the Swedes. So here are two major reasons why somebody would leave England and come to the colonies. Number one is economic freedom. There's some parts of America provided fertile land for farming. If you had a farm, if you owned land, that means that you could make money. So those who were too poor to gain passage to America actually were sponsored by people that were already in the colonies. In return, they would provide servitude until they paid off that debt. We call that indentured servitude. Majority of servants would work for 4 to 7 years until they could pay their way out of servitude. And the basic investment of work for transport was so that they can develop a better life for themselves in the New World. So at the time, England was in religious unrest. Okay, people couldn't agree about what to do about religion. There were a lot of new ideas about religion that were coming to the forefront. And because of that, some people were persecuted because of their religious beliefs. Because they were being persecuted, a lot of these people decided to come to the colonies so that they could worship and practice their religion freely. One of these groups is known as the Puritans. The reason why we call them Puritans is because they wanted to purify their religion and purify the church in England. So we talked about their religious unrest. Because we had people that disagreed, if you disagreed, you were actually known as a dissenter. So a person who opposes a group or official commonly held beliefs is known as a dissenter. So Puritans left England in search of religious freedom. But ironically, once they got to the New World, they actually didn't let people practice their religion freely. So within the Puritan group that came to America, there were some that dissented from that Puritan belief that they originally held true. And just like the Puritans were persecuted in England, the Puritans themselves actually started to persecute these dissenters. Those dissenters were forced to leave Massachusetts, and they went on to found states or colonies at this point, such as Rhode Island and Connecticut. Rhode Island was very popular because of the freedoms that it provided the colonists. And Connecticut actually developed the first constitution in America. We call this the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So what was life like in the colonies? So by 1733, there were 13 American colonies on the east coast of the United States. So based on the geography of the region, that influenced how those colonies were going to make money and how their economies functioned. And then based on those economies, people developed a way of life in each specific region of the colonies. Up north, we have the New England colonies. We still refer to this area of the United States as New England. So the colonies in this area were the Massachusetts Bay Colony, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Most people lived in small towns. Because of the rocky soil here, it was very, very difficult to farm. A lot of the farms that did exist were small and located near towns. A lot of the colonists were Puritan. Other people in these colonies were employed as shipbuilders or maybe some fishermen. And the region's bountiful forests provided wood for boats. Colonists also hunted and then trapped certain animals for furs in which they would trade. Furs were also used for things like coats and hats. The middle colonies consisted of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Soil was a little bit better for farming here. So farmers raised wheat in this area, which is known as a cash crop. So what a cash crop is a crop that's grown in abundance specifically to be sold for profit. So in New England, those farms were super small, and really they were growing food just to feed their family. In the middle colonies, the farms were way larger, and it wasn't just to feed their families, but also to turn a profit and create some sort of business out of it. Because of the abundance of crops in this area, port cities like New York and Philadelphia began to expand, and all of these businesses were owned by colonists from places like Germany and Holland. The middle colonies were also very rich in resources, such as sawmills, mines, ironworks, and other businesses in the region grew because of their rich resources. Colonists also depended on resources such as lumber, metals, and natural harbors, obviously in Philadelphia and in New York as well. Now, the southern colonies are a little bit different than the New England colonies and the middle colonies. The southern colonies consisted of the following. You had Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. On the southern colonies, you had large-scale agricultural operations. The predominant driver of the southern economy is going to be the plantation system, in which these large farms produce abundances of cash crops. Tobacco and rice are the main cash crops, and because the southern colonies have low, flat-lying coastal plains, it made them very, very conducive for giant agricultural production. At first, indentured servants worked on these plantations, but then as the colonies grew, enslaved Africans began to make the majority of the workforce up in the southern colonies. So as you moved further inland in the southern colonies, the soil became poorer and farms were smaller. We are now approaching the Appalachian Mountain regions in the southern colonies. Farmers grew what they needed for their families, very similar to in the New England colonies. Smaller farmers actually outnumbered the plantations, but the plantations held a lot of the power. Why? Because they were the main economic drivers of the southern colonies. If you are the one that is stimulating the economy, chances are that you have more power than the smaller farmers. Because of the power that the plantation owners had, they were the ones that were controlling politics in the area. And again, plantations are going to be that main economic driving force in the southern colonies. Let's continue our conversation about the colonies by specifically talking about colonial governments. So before we get started, go ahead and drop in the comments what you think one of the catalysts was for independence based on what we know about the colonies currently. One of the major issues with colonial governments is that messages from England took forever to arrive. Now, we don't have planes, we don't have trains, we have boats, but none of them are even powered by gas or any sort of fuel. So messages took weeks to arrive from England to the colonies. That's a very ineffective way of running a government. Because of the distance between England and the colonies, colonists began to see themselves as colonists and less as British citizens. So I talked about in the beginning of this lesson that the predominant understanding once the colonists reached America in the first place was that they are British. That sentiment is starting to shift. Colonists are starting to see themselves as Americans or colonists instead of English. At this time, it's important to understand what England had going for it, right? England controlled an enormous portion of the world at this point, right? So 13 small colonies on the eastern portion of North America isn't necessarily their biggest concern. As Americans, we like to think that they really cared about us tremendously, but it's not really the truth, right? They had other things going on, and these 13 small colonies, yes, they were important, but it wasn't necessarily on the top of the list for England. Domestically, inside of England, we have a power struggle between Parliament and the King. Parliament began to start to regulate colonial trade, and back in the 1600s, 1700s, it's very, very difficult to regulate ships offloading goods in the colonies, right? We don't have a lot of technology. In order to actually understand where they were offloading and onloading goods, it would take a lot of intelligence, and you'd actually have to physically be there to witness it. Talking about colonial governments, each colony had a governor appointed by the king. So the king would say, hey, I want you to go control Virginia. I want you to go govern over New York. Laws were normally passed by the local assembly. Eventually, these assemblies grow stronger. They have powers such as the ability to tax and budget. And these assemblies are going to start to use their power to weaken the royal governors, right? So these elected assemblies full of colonists are going to actively try to weaken the power of the government because, again, that shift is occurring. They are seeing themselves as American colonists. They are not seeing themselves as English subjects anymore. By the mid-1700s, a lot of the colonies are actually going to be governing themselves. Colonists were aware of writings by people such as John Locke, who basically said the government exists to serve the people, not to oppress them and control them. The sentiment at this time is that Britain put its feelings and priorities over the colonists, and colonists are going to start to get upset about the fact that they have less rights than those living in England. They're almost seen as second-class citizens. This brings us to the Great Awakening, where preachers began to stress the importance of personal religious experiences, as opposed to listening to the messages of church leaders. And instead of going and developing a relationship with God through your church leader, the Great Awakening really says that you can develop that relationship yourself. You don't need that intermediary. This, plus the Enlightenment ideas from people such as John Locke, really developed a strong sense of liberty in the colonies. Now, the French and Indian War is very interesting. So the British began to expand its territory that it won from France, but the thing is that there were still Native Americans in that area. So the French and the Native Americans joined forces to fight against the British. So yes, it's called the French and Indian War, but the French and the Native Americans are actually in an alliance fighting the British. Britain eventually wins the war and takes back that territory from France and the Native Americans. Now we're talking about this area west of the Appalachian Mountains that's going to come into play in the future. Now, because we just won this new territory, the first thing the colonists are going to want to do is expand into that territory. Why? Because of their ability to grow crops, their ability to own land, their ability to make money for their families and succeed both religiously and economically. So the first thing that King George does is issues the Proclamation of 1763, which specifically states that colonists cannot move into that area west of the Appalachian Mountains that was won during the French and Indian War. Because the king was so harsh about this, the colonists actually are going to think that the king is trying to limit their economic freedom by not allowing them to move into the new territory, develop a life, grow crops, etc. Now, the reason why King George did this is because he was also fighting in Europe, right? The French and Indian War, a lot of wars that he was fighting over in Europe actually indebted the English crown pretty severely. So in an attempt to not get into another war, which is already basically putting a pretty strict financial strain on England, he issues this proclamation. So on King George's front, right, he's saying, don't go over there because I don't have enough money to start a new war, right? On the colonist front, they're saying, well, that's technically our territory. Why are you trying to limit our economic freedom? We want to go over there. We want to develop a life that is better than the one that we currently have. So the British Crown gets even more brazen and more oppressive towards the colonists. We can see this with things like the Stamp Act. So what the Stamp Act says is that the colonists have to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper, ship documents, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, and any other publication. So basically anything that could have a stamp on it, the colonists are going to have to pay an extra tax on. The Townshend Act is named after Charles Townshend, and he's a British treasurer who placed taxes on paint, glass, lead, and other paper products. And this was intended to combat smuggling. Remember when I said previously that it was very difficult for the British to basically identify and stop colonial smuggling because, we don't have a lot of technology. You'd really have to be there to see the act going on. Because England was losing so much money based on colonial smuggling, they decided to implement this tax as well. The Tea Act required colonists to buy tea only from the British East India Company. Now, there were other companies that sold tea, but basically the British created a monopoly and only allowed the colonists to purchase tea from them. Again, being able to set prices and, again, trying to combat the smuggling in the area and stimulate their economy by making more money off of the colonists. This eventually leads us to the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so the Sons of Liberty go ahead and they raid English merchant boats that were in Boston Harbor. They throw all of the tea overboard. Really good video if you follow the link that is in this slide that kind of goes through that. But everybody's familiar with the Boston Tea Party. It was an act of rebellion. Basically, the colonists were upset about the taxes and decided to act out by taking British tea, dumping it into the harbor. Now, here's a list of some of the intolerable acts. You have the Boston Port Act, which basically closed Boston Harbor until the colonists repaid the tea that they spilled into the harbor. You have the Massachusetts Government Act, which made town meetings illegal. You have the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, and you have the Quebec Act. So really interesting about all of these acts and the way that the British Crown treated the colonists. A lot of these things were addressed directly in the US Constitution. So when we go into the video about the US Constitution, I want you to remember the way that England treated the colonists, and the founding fathers of America still remember that, still held that very dear to themselves, and immediately addressed that in places like the Bill of Rights. One more thing I want to say about taxation and the colonists. The colonists weren't necessarily upset about having to pay the tax. What they were upset about is they had no say in how those taxes were actually implemented. For example, right, the Stamp Act, right, the Townshend Act. The colonists, yes, they had to pay the taxes on the certain items, but it was more about the fact that they never had a say or never had a vote or were never considered in that decision making. So it wasn't necessarily about the actual act of paying the taxes. It was more about the fact that they didn't have a say in how they were taxed and what that tax revenue was being used for, again, because they were seen as less of an English citizen and more of a second-class citizen over in the colonies. As the colonists get more upset with the English crown, they're going to rely on a lot of influences that are going to kind of lead the colonies into a new path and ultimately to independence. So one of the foundational beliefs of the colonists was the idea of democracy, all right? So this was the idea that people rule, right? Power from the people. A democratic society is not ruled by a dictator or a monarch, it is ruled by the people. So actually Judaism possesses a lot of these ideas of a democracy, so the colonists were influenced by that for sure. Another major influence on the colonists was the idea of the direct democracy, and we get this from ancient Greece. Now, a direct democracy works very, very well when the population is small. So we saw that with the Mayflower Compact. That was technically a direct democracy. But once the populations get too large, it's really impossible for a direct democracy to work properly. So a more efficient way of implementing democracy in places with large populations is to put in place a representative democracy. This is where individuals or citizens elect an official to represent them and make decisions on behalf of them in the halls of government, right? This is what we have in America. A republic is an example of a representative democracy. So again, when populations are huge, it's actually not really realistic to have everybody come in and raise their hand and vote on specific issues that affect people. The better way is to elect an official and have that official vote on your behalf. We see this idea of the republic in ancient Rome. In Rome, senators actually are going to run the government, and these were elected officials. Now, not only did people influence the colonist idea about government, but also some specific documents. So in 1215, you have the Magna Carta. And why the Magna Carta is so crucial is because it promotes the idea of a limited government. Now, whenever you see Magna Carta on a test or a quiz or from the state of Florida, okay, the answer has to do with limited government, I promise you, all right? So why the Magna Carta is so important is because it limited the king's power and preserved some power for the nobility in England as well. So here are some important points of the Magna Carta. Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like and take a screenshot. So in the 1300s, you had the idea of a parliament. Specific function of parliament was to make laws. Because Parliament was more of a democratic system, this was obviously at odds with the king, and the king would sometimes dismiss Parliament and not really, listen to what they were saying. Because of this, they forced the king to sign the Petition of Rights, which was very similar to Magna Carta. Again, we're talking about limited government. This power struggle progressed and eventually leads us to the English Bill of Rights, again with the specific idea of limiting the king's power and preserving some of that power for the people. Other things that the English Bill of Rights did is separation of powers, limited the power of the king and queen. They could no longer collect taxes without Parliament's permission, listed all of the rights of English citizens, not just for the nobles. So remember, Magna Carta was specifically for the nobility. The English Bill of Rights extends that to all Englishmen. And also the idea of petitioning the government. Again, a lot of these ideas are what the founding fathers implemented when they wrote our own constitution, so definitely pay attention to this. We also have the idea of the Enlightenment. So thinkers like Hobbes, like John Locke, okay? These people had a different way of viewing government and how government should interact with people and how people should interact with their government. Specifically, how people viewed God, the world, and the universe, and the Enlightenment thinkers wanted to apply new ideas about the laws of the universe and nature into government to make government more efficient and less oppressive. One of those important Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke, and he developed the idea of natural rights. So what natural rights are, by definition, is the following. Rights everybody should have as the right of life, liberty, and property. Sounds a lot like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in one of our very, very important American documents. The other thing that Locke brought to the table was the idea that government existed to protect the people's rights, okay? And government does not get power unless it's from the consent of the governed. Right? The consent of the people that are going to actually follow the laws that are implemented. Another very important thinking that Locke had was the idea of the social contract. So the social contract basically says that people will give up some rights in order for the government to protect them. For example, I can't go around and start punching people in the face, right? I give up the right to walk around and punch people in the face so that the government protects me from being punched in the face. This is the idea of the social contract, and it is one of the crucial points of American government that we still hold true today. Tensions between the colonists and the British king are coming to a boiling point. You have the ideas of the Enlightenment, you have the Townshend Acts, you have the Intolerable Acts, stuff like the Stamp Act. You also have the fact that England is so far away and the colonists are actually governing themselves at this point. All of these factors are going to lead to the First Continental Congress. So in August of 1774, delegates or representatives from 12 of the colonies met to discuss the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. They had a specific agenda, all right? So their agenda was to send a letter to the king asking him to restore their rights. So the First Continental Congress is not about a revolution yet, all right? The purpose of the First Continental Congress is to ask King George very politely to restore their rights, to treat them as British citizens, to stop taking advantage of them, and things like that, okay? So it's not about a revolution just yet. It's not about becoming independent just yet. It's really about restoring rights. The king's response was even harsher measures against the colonists. So if you're asking for, your rights to be restored and the king responds with even harsher measures, chances are you're not going to be too happy with him, correct? Here's an actual quote. The New England colonies are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are subject to this country or independent. Now, the Second Continental Congress had a completely different agenda. Okay, so in April of 1775, British troops fought the Colonial Minutemen in Lexington and Concord. This is going to be the first battle of the American Revolution. Congress at this time was the acting governing body for the colonies, and not every member at first favored a split with Britain. Okay, Congress debated the topic for months. So even though it's obvious that the colonists and the king are not getting along and blows, right, physical fighting, like the king said, are going to come to a head, not all of the delegates, not all of the colonists are on board with becoming independent from England. So you have this split. On one side, you have the revolutionaries, right? The colonists and the patriots that are trying to fight for America. And on the other side, you have the loyalists who are still loyal to the British crown. So in 1776, Thomas Paine publishes a pamphlet known as Common Sense. Okay, so a lot of the ideas that Paine used in this pamphlet were from people like John Locke, the Enlightenment thinkers. And Paine called for the colonists to rebel against the king's abuses of power and become independent from England. More than 500,000 copies of this pamphlet were published and released, all right? So that's like going platinum today if you're Drake or Taylor Swift or another artist, all right? This is incredible. Thomas Paine basically went viral before going viral was a thing. By the spring of 1776, more than half of the colonists favored a split from England. A lot of this has to do with this pamphlet written by Thomas Paine. Because of the sentiment was shifting from staying loyal and to becoming independent, Congress decided to draft a document explaining to England why they should be free. Obviously, this is known as the Declaration of Independence. On the committee were people such as John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And Thomas Jefferson was actually chosen to pen the document. Jefferson was also influenced by John Locke, and I talked about this a little bit earlier on in the lesson. This is directly from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke said life, liberty, and property, right? So you can see how Jefferson was influenced by Locke very heavily and how that influence directly related to the Declaration of Independence. So on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock was the first to sign, and he also has the largest signature. The Declaration of Independence was the most revolutionary document at the time and still probably is. No other government was based on the idea that the people got to govern themselves. At this time, the idea of democracy was not a thing around the world, right? The idea that government serves the people and not the people serve the government was completely novel at this time. The Declaration of Independence kind of puts a highlight on that. Thank you all so much for hanging out as we discussed colonial America in Civics IQ Episode 4. Episode 5, we're going to actually talk about the Constitution, so you don't want to miss out. If you found value in today's video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.